Well, anyways, this frosty Sunday morning, we're going to be taking another trip. But this time, we're going to go to an arid valley in the Mediterranean, to a city that's 845 feet below sea level, actually making it the lowest city on earth. But because of that, it also gives it this beautifully warm climate, which is why many Roman emperors would sometimes winter there. Our destination city was once described in Deuteronomy 34 as the city of palm trees. Who couldn't use a little bit of palm tree right now, huh? I know I should. I sure could. Well, our destination city is the now 11,000-year-old Jericho. As I mentioned several weeks ago, in this time between Epiphany and Lent, we're going to pay attention to the stories of Jesus and his ministry. Today, we're engaging the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. And I didn't know until after deciding on this story, but this last Sunday before Lent, Ash Wednesday is on the 14th here, on Wednesday, the Eastern Orthodox churches celebrate this as Zacchaeus Sunday. Partly because this is the last story of Jesus' ministry before he heads into Jerusalem for his sufferings. The Western Church, we celebrate the Transfiguration, but the Eastern Orthodox, it's Zacchaeus Sunday. So, coincidence? Maybe, but I think not. Well, I'm going to be pulling from some old notes that we made while studying this passage with my father about 7 years ago when we taught through Luke's gospel. Every week we would work together through our messages and so forth as we were doing this series together, and had a lot of great study times, made a lot of great notes, and had a lot of great insights. So why waste that work? So you're going to hear some echoes today of Pastor Don, because I'm going to take some of those notes that we made together as we work through this story. When reading a familiar story like this, like the story of Zacchaeus, it's easy to tune out and just to gloss over it. Like, oh yeah, I've heard this one before. You know what? Nothing new here to see. Or the really deadly, I already know it all. It's as if we can just, kind of take a nap and cruise on through, accepting our preconceived pedestrian moral of the story that we all kind of know and go from there. Well, here's the thing. If the stories of Jesus are not exposing our heart, if they're not turning our world upside down, if they're not making us see everything in a whole new way, then we know that we haven't quite looked hard enough yet. We haven't cried out for new eyes and a spirit of revelation. Jesus will always challenge you. Jesus will always challenge your heart. If you're not being challenged by Jesus, there's an excellent chance you're not actually listening to him. Jesus will always challenge you. So with that in mind, let's dig right into our scripture passage here. We're going to read Luke 19, starting at verse 1. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he's going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble, and they said, He is gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half my possessions, Lord, I am giving to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of everything, I am giving back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Well, first in our story, we see Jesus. He's left the northern country of Galilee where he was raised, never to return again. He's headed to Jerusalem, where he knows he will be crucified. Jericho is on the way south down to Jerusalem. There's nothing business as usual about this trip. This is the last recorded story of Jesus before he enters his sufferings into Jerusalem, which is why we're going to see a picture here of the nature of Jesus' ministry, as this picture will speak back into everything that he's done. Jesus enters into Jericho, which was a trade center and kind of a resort town, which was frequented by many of the who's who of the region. I kind of imagine it like an ancient version of Palm Springs, California, or something like that. It's a really nice place to go, especially during the winter times. And because it was such a nice place, there was considerable wealth in that place. Well, here in this warm, beautiful city of Jericho, we meet Zacchaeus. And we immediately learn 3 things about Zacchaeus. 1, he's a chief tax collector. Now, that he was a chief tax collector means that he's not just a tax collector, but that he oversees many tax collectors under his authority. So by implication, he's a good leader among his peers. He's got good management and people skills. But also as the chief, he's at the top of the collection pyramid. So this means that he'd typically earn a cut of the commission from all those who collected taxes from under him, which leads us to our next observation. He's rich. And because he's rich, we're drawn into this common human suspicion that he acquired his wealth through corruption. Because, it's kind of like what we do today. We often apply that same prejudice in social or public conversations where we speak of the rich or the 1%ers, that there's something filthy about them. And, of course, those sentiments aren't without reason. There definitely are those who are like that. But there's just this immediate assumption that kind of pops up in our head. Now, compound that with the fact that he's not only a tax collector, but he's their chief. So this adds public belief that certainly this guy is a total crook. He is a rotter. As well, there's this stigma that as a wealthy person, he's greedy, he's stingy, he's anything but generous, he's all about himself. Greedy, little, wealthy tax collector. Last thing that we read about Zacchaeus, he's short. He's just a little guy. It's kind of like to add insult to injury. Everybody already hates you, and then you're just this wee little guy. I kind of, when I read the story, I imagine him with a kind of this little squeaky, whiny voice. It's just like he's just got the short end of the stick, literally, on all fronts here. It says that he's even too small to see over a crowd. I can imagine being this guy and kind of putting myself in his shoes, and it's just like, it probably didn't always feel very good to be him, with all of these things against him. We know from this story and from others in the New Testament that the people hated all tax collectors. They hated tax collectors. They were seen as allies of their oppressors, the Roman government, colluding with the Roman subjugation of the Promised Land. They were like traitors to their fellow Jews. And the expectation was that when the Messiah would come, he would overthrow the Roman government, give them back their Promised Land, and of course, he would overthrow all those dirty tax collectors right with him. In the Gospels, we notice that the Jewish religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, they always say tax collectors and sinners in the same breath. As if there's, it's kind of the same thing. There's no difference here. Anyone who collects taxes for Caesar is surely headed straight to hell. And so there must be a special hell for anyone who trains and supervises tax collectors. In other words, a chief tax collector like Zacchaeus. Now, as we read this story, this crowd obviously shares that opinion. They don't like him. They don't like him at all. Zacchaeus is an outsider. He's despised. He's alienated. He's rejected. He's unworthy to be anyone's friend. Nobody dare hang out with this guy, as they might even be implicated in sharing in his sin. And when we look at this story, let's be honest, we generally join in on this opinion. Do we not? We look, Zacchaeus, he's a tax collector. He's the bad guy. He's a crooked traitor, and he's just reaping the consequences of all that he deserves. So we don't really have a whole lot of sympathy for the dude. And of course, it's not for lack of evidence either. We have many New Testament stories acknowledging the poor behavior of tax collectors, and I'm sure we've heard a number of teachers and preachers even mention the wickedness of the tax collectors and so forth. Well, now, let's put ourselves in Zacchaeus' tiny little shoes for a moment. We really need to feel the weight of this. If the chosen people of God shun you and condemn you, it's very hard to believe that the father of the household of faith, namely God himself, doesn't also shun you and reject you. If you read the Old Testament carefully, you'll notice that divine discipline usually comes in this form, that people are cut off from the community, that they're set outside of the camp. Now, this is usually done as a protection for the community, but this is what divine discipline would look like. In the New Testament, we see similar things as well. Well, for the sake of everyone, people are cut off from the community. So the people of Jesus' time here in this story, they were doing what they considered their righteous job. They shunned and condemned this Zacchaeus because he was a tax collector. Well, on this one day in this esteemed city, Jesus comes to town. Jesus is coming near. And it's almost imaginable that by this time the word of Jesus was not well known to all in this area. Jesus is coming to town. Excitement stirs. Crowds gather. Zacchaeus hears about something. He knows something's up. And even though he was living under the weight of public condemnation, Zacchaeus was aware of his spiritual hunger, and he was curious. Could this possibly be the answer? Could there possibly be something here in this Jesus? We read the text saying this. He was trying to see who Jesus was. He wanted to know who Jesus was. This desperate, alienated man wanted to know who Jesus was. If God was at work in Jesus, if there's any hope in Israel, even for people like him, he wanted to see what this is about. And maybe, just maybe even through Jesus, he could get a glimpse of what God was like. With the crowd surrounding Jesus and he being too short, he had but one option. This is the favorite part in every kid's storybook. He ran ahead and he climbs up a sycamore tree to see him because he's going to pass that way. So here we have this man of notable title. He's significantly wealthy. And he's very likely dressed in some fine clothing, like some sort of first century Armani suit or something like that. An Ahmed suit, I don't know. So here he is, this guy, wealthy, well-dressed, and he's up in a tree. What? Like, imagine that ridiculous picture for a moment. There's everybody around Jesus and this little guy up in the tree. I mean, being found in a tree for such an esteemed person is hardly a place of dignity. Something significant is going on here. But he wanted to see who Jesus was. And he was willing to risk the humiliation of being the little guy in the tree. He wanted to see who Jesus was. Doesn't matter who you are. That takes some guts. And then, in this scene, in the most unexpected and surprising reversal, what do we read? Jesus sees Zacchaeus. Jesus sees who Zacchaeus was. He saw Zacchaeus with the eyes of God. He knew Zacchaeus with the heart of the Father. Now, while Zacchaeus was hungry and curious, it's Jesus who initiates and takes decisive action. Jesus says to him, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for I must stay at your house today. In the original Greek text, that word must, it's like a strong emphasis. I really must stay at your house today. Jesus is interested in this outcast in a serious way. When Jesus calls his name, Zacchaeus is overcome with joy at being seen and being valued. I mean, most time he's not seen because he's a little guy, but he's not seen because he's that tax collector, that filthy, greedy, dirty tax collector. But Jesus calls his name, and Zacchaeus is seen, and he's valued. I must stay at your house today. It's the cry of every human heart to be seen, to be understood, and to be called forth. And Jesus does this for Zacchaeus. Jesus sees me. He even knows my name. Wow. I mean, if you've ever had that experience, that revelation revolutionizes your life, and you're never the same. Jesus sees me, and he knows me. So Zacchaeus, he hops down from the tree and he happily welcomes Jesus into his home. And the crowd is seething and murmuring. They hate it. They hate what's going on here. You're not supposed to be with him. If anybody, you should be with us. Why are you with him? Why are you with him? It's like, Jesus, you're way out of line here. I mean, surely he knows that Zacchaeus is unworthy. He's unclean. He's dirty. He's a tax collector. They're upset because Jesus doesn't go along with their majority opinion on this guy. You know, how dare you go against the crowd about what we know about this dude? How dare you, Jesus? So they murmur. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who's a sinner. Nobody dare hang out with him, as they know they might be implicated in his sin. Jesus knew that too, but he did it anyway. Jesus was coming to seek and to save the lost. And here's the thing. The lost aren't always evil people. Sometimes they're just lost. They don't fit. They're not accepted. They don't belong. They're judged. They're alienated. ostracized. Now, traditionally, we've agreed with the prejudices of the crowd when we've interpreted this story. Traditionally, when we read this, Zacchaeus is the greedy little tax collector. He's a bad, bad man, and he's been caught in sin, cheating people. So in meeting with Jesus, he's convicted by God, and now he's promised Jesus that he's going to turn a new leaf, and from now on, he'll give half his goods to the poor, and he'll restore fourfold to all the people that he may have defrauded. But if we pay close attention to the text, that's not what it actually says. Now, as my father and I were studying this passage together quite a few years ago, and we were contemplating some insights from some scholars, it seemed to us that our familiar read on this story that we usually see it with was actually kind of sketchy. So we looked up Luke 19 in the original Greek text, and we decided to read it on the prompting of a few scholars. It was interesting what we found. Zacchaeus was not hanging his head in shame as if he were caught red-handed. There's no hint of that in the text. None of it. We see that in other texts and other stories, but not here. There's no shame in Zacchaeus over this. Jesus actually saw him. He saw Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus knew it. Zacchaeus knew that he had actually been seen. And so now he could finally speak to someone who would recognize the truth about him. And so he laid it all out. He said to Jesus, and here's the thing, it's in the present tense that he speaks. He says, "Look, Lord, half of my possessions I am giving, or I always give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I am giving, or I always give back 4 times as much." So in the original Greek, the words used, they denote this continuous, ongoing action in the present tense. And if you have an NASB or a New King James translation of the Bible, you'll notice the annotation right there in the notes. It notes that this is the actual literal translation of the passage. The thing is, however, because many modern translations assume this wicked guilt upon Zacchaeus, they change it to the future tense, like I will give, because I wasn't doing this before, but I will do this now, like he's trying to come clean here. Well, the point is this, that we see with a little bit more careful reading of the text, is that Zacchaeus may be a tax collector. He may be working for those Romans, which is not cool with his Jewish friends who want their promised land back. Zacchaeus may be a tax collector, but he's not a selfish, greedy cheater. He's not the selfish, greedy cheater that we've assumed. Notice also Jesus' response to Zacchaeus after he says this. "Today, salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham." Salvation came. Why? Well, we have to stick to what the text says here. The text says, because he too is a son of Abraham. So what does Abraham have to do with any of this? Well, a couple of things. I think first and most importantly is this. Abraham is regarded as the father of faith. Jesus is identifying what no one else, blinded by their prejudice against tax collectors, could see. The small man is standing tall in faith. Zacchaeus is a man of faith. And here's where the story takes on an even heavier irony. This story, partly, it's contrasted to that of the rich young ruler from the previous chapter. And we read about this guy, that he's upright and obedient to the law, and he's in good standing with everyone in the community. yet he couldn't let go of his wealth, and thus he could not follow Jesus. Jesus just pegged him on it right away. It's like, yeah, I get it. You obeyed all the commandments, but there's this one thing you lacked. Dude, you're holding on tight to your gold, and that ain't going to work. And now here, in the next chapter, we contrast it with Zacchaeus. And Jesus calls him out as a man of faith. The irony is so heavy here. The tax collector is far better at practicing mercy, and the tax collector is far better at practicing justice than any of the crowd that condemns him. If we pay attention to the text here, look at the numbers here. Now we know that the highest standard of the law, according to the Old Testament, required 20% restitution. But Zacchaeus practiced fourfold recompense. Whoa. He took upon himself the penalty for livestock rustlers. Like, this is one of the worst things you could do in the Old Testament. And he took on that penalty. You know, if I've crossed the line ever, if I've ever defrauded anybody, made a kind of a false accusations while doing your taxes, fourfold. Zacchaeus is far surpassing the standard of the law to the nth degree. According to Jewish traditions, giving 20% of your belongings to the poor was considered very generous. The 10% tithe was the standard. The 20%, it's like, yeah, you're there. You've arrived. But what do we see here? Zacchaeus is giving away 50%. He chose to give it. He chose to give 50%. Who in the community of Israel would ever suspect such generosity from a filthy tax collector? A chief tax collector. Who would expect that from him, let alone practice it themselves? Who among all the people from the household of faith would ever imagine such a level of integrity? Who among all his judges and accusers would ever expect such godliness? That kind of action, it requires serious faith. And Jesus sees his faith. And he affirms it and he calls it forward. Today, salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham. Now, there's another aspect of this as well. Because he's a tax collector, his fellow Jewish brothers, they wrote him off. Nah, you're with the Romans. Jesus is like, no. He too is a son of Abraham. Jesus is doing something for this outcast. In that moment, Jesus himself restores Zacchaeus to the assembly of the upright, to the congregation of Israel, to the people of God. Those people proclaimed him a sinner. They proclaimed him an outcast. But Jesus proclaims righteous, true son of Abraham. He turns it all around. He declares the one you despised is to be embraced as your brother. Zacchaeus was lost. Zacchaeus was lost. He was misplaced, misunderstood, misjudged, alienated, ostracized. And Jesus found him. Jesus found him and he brought him home. By the word of Jesus, the small man could stand tall. How Jesus encounters Zacchaeus here is a challenge to all of us, especially to those of us who find ourselves on the inside, so to speak. We clearly see the coming of the kingdom of God is for the outcast. And this is fantastic news, especially if or when the outcast is me or you. The kingdom of God is coming for the outcast. God is calling his children home. All of them. All of them. Not just the ones we like. All of them. Not just the ones we can find some sort of reason to claim worthiness. All of them. Jesus is welcoming those who we are sometimes content to keep out. One of the errors us insiders can make is to separate ourselves from the world in such a way that we kind of lose contact with the outsiders, with the sinners, with the outcasts. Often it starts off, fairly benign as a desire to not compromise to a way of living that would destroy our integrity. The challenge of Jesus here is to turn away from those subtle but deadly feelings of superiority that somehow we're better than them. At least I'm not a tax collector. Jesus is calling us to remember that the same gracious work of God that has secured our blessing is reaching out for others to come home. The only way that any of us come home is through his grace. We're sunk without it. They're sunk without it. We're all sunk without it. But thank God he is gracious. Jesus, he's giving sight to our blindness so that in humility we can acknowledge our own weakness, and in humility we can also see the work of God that's happening in others who are weak. Jesus, give us eyes to see like you do. Give us eyes to see like you saw Zacchaeus. That filthy tax collector, the little guy up in the tree, whom we wrote off, yet you saw him as so valuable that you called him home. You extended him the invitation. I must stay with you. Jesus, give us eyes to see. Help us to see the tax collectors who are the sons and daughters of Abraham. So this begs the question, who's the Zacchaeus near you? There's something about these stories that always draw us to apply them and put them into our circumstance here and now. Who's the Zacchaeus near you? Who's the one that you might look off or look at and be willing to just write them off? Real quick. Oh, that guy. When I was preparing this message, I prayed and asked the Lord, who's a Zacchaeus for me? And then popped right into my head. It's your neighbor across the street and about 4 doors down. Now, the neighbors, most of the neighbors don't know his name. They just refer to him as the drunk. He's the drunk guy. And most every time we see him, actually, I don't know that I've ever seen him when he isn't heavily inebriated. And it's usually when it's warm outside and he's out there and he's always got a beer in his hand, and because he's had Only God knows how many beers. He gets real chatty, and but what do all the neighbors do? It's just like, he's out. Everybody scatters. And I know a couple times I encountered him and started talking with him, and I caught myself a couple times like, oh, blah, 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 beep, I'm out of beer, I got to get another one. And I was thinking in my head, here's my chance to exit. It's like, no, why are you running away on your neighbor like that? Now, the situation is a little bit different than what we see with Zacchaeus here. I mean, this guy did have some issues, but the same prejudice is there, the same things that would call me to just kind of shove this guy aside and not give him a second look. I asked the Lord, who's my Zacchaeus? And he showed me. Ooh, that was kind of ugly. Sorry, Lord. I won't do that. I won't do that again. So then it occurred to me, the prayer in the Psalm, search my heart, O God, and if there's any wicked way in me, lead me in the way everlasting. Do I have a prejudice against some other guy, some Zacchaeus, some group of people equivalent to the tax collectors? Do I have some sort of prejudice that prevents me from seeing what Jesus sees? That's a big issue here. Jesus saw something that nobody else did. And because of that blindness, there was a lot of ugly behavior. Might it be possible that in seeing through the eyes of Jesus, we might find a treasure, just like Jesus did? Hold on here. This guy is a man of faith, way more than any of you guys. This is a man of generosity, way more than any of you guys. It's like those in Jericho. We might find a precious faith greater than our own. So we want to operate in both the compassion and the wisdom of Jesus to see, to understand, and to call forth, and to help the small people stand tall. It's the Jesus way. There's also another question that's begged here too. Are you a Zacchaeus? Are you a Zacchaeus? You ever feel looked down upon? You ever feel small, forgotten, looked over, misjudged, outcast, rejected, little value or worth? I think at some point in our lives, all of us can relate to Zacchaeus here. What we see in Jesus is really good news. We see the compassion of God through Jesus. We see the love of Jesus that's willing to take some flack, some serious flack, to reach out and to extend grace. Jesus sees us just like he saw him, as precious and worthy of his attention. Of all the things he could be paying attention to do, he sees you. You're worth it. You're worth it to your heavenly Father that he sent Jesus for you. And Jesus sends his invitation to fellowship. I must stay with you. I must stay with you today. Jesus invites you. So if we can learn anything from this little tax collector, all you small people, all you who feel small, I should say it that way, all you who feel small, stand tall and welcome him. Because Jesus will see you. He will know you. He will understand you. He will see great value in you. He will see a place for you. And he will call you forth in who you really are. Maybe as he gives you new eyes, you can see what Jesus sees in yourself. Like Zacchaeus, a truth hidden to men, but a truth seen by Jesus and one that he reveals to us. By his word, all of us who feel small can stand tall. His word is true. You are sons and daughters of Abraham, heirs of faith, beloved, blessed members of the family of God. He says, you are mine. Amen.